The 95th Infantry Division was pitted against the German Army for 145 days during World War II, including 103 days of continual front-line contact with the enemy. Known as the Victory Division in Patton's Third Army, they would capture the ancient city of Metz and attack along the Siegfried Line in the Saar River Valley. By the war's end, the 95th Infantry Division had established a distinguished legacy of combat actions in the ETO. This is the history of the 95th Division, the Iron Men of Metz. As World War I raged on in Europe, the U.S. Army required additional infantrymen. In response, the 95th Infantry Division was constituted on September 5, 1918, at Camp Sherman, Ohio. Its first commanding officer was West Point graduate Brigadier General Matthew C. Smith. The majority of the new recruits were from Oklahoma and Kansas, and this was the inspiration behind the OK shoulder patch, which identified soldiers of the 95th Infantry Division. World War I ended in November, and shortly thereafter, the 95th Division was reconstituted as a reserve unit and posted at Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. In a little over 23 years after the end of World War I, the United States was drawn into World War II after the December 7, 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor. 3 months following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Brigadier General Harry L. Twaddle was assigned command of the 95th Infantry Division. The division was officially activated July 10, 1942 at Camp Swift, Texas. Camp Swift was brand new, and the men who filled its barracks came from all parts of the United States. Previously, General Twaddle had been attached to the War Department's Operations and Training Division, and later as Assistant Chief of Staff for Operations on the War Department's General Staff. As such, he was exceptionally well qualified in the areas of training and mobilization for the Army's preparation for war. The 95th Infantry Division adopted a newly designed shoulder patch in August 1942 during training at Camp Swift. Designed by Lieutenant Colonel Leland B. Coor, the insignia used the national colors of red, white, and blue to represent the national character of the division, as it was made up from men from every state. The Arabic 9 in artillery red is encased with a white Roman numeral V for victory and mounted on a field of infantry blue. From the very beginning, the victory theme on the insignia inspired the nickname, the Victory Division. That nickname was officially adopted in September 1943. After 17 weeks of basic training at Camp Swift, the 95th Infantry Division transferred to Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas. Here, soldiers underwent additional training, including forced 25-mile marches to Camp Cibolo and Camp Bulis. In July 1943, the 95th Infantry Division relocated to Camp Polk, Louisiana for Louisiana maneuvers. These and other maneuvers were planned and executed by the Army's senior leaders to hone the Army's skills in large formation, test new equipment, cull out unfit commanders, and test unit readiness. After returning to Fort Sam Houston, they once again prepared to move out. This time, their troop train delivered them to Camp Coxcomb near Desert Center, California. Camp Coxcomb was established as a training center for desert exercises. By the end of January 1944, the 95th Infantry Division loaded the troop train again. On a cold morning, February the 5th, after a long trip across the United States, they finally arrived at their next installation, Fort Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania. Here, the division was to continue its preparation for deployment and to add soldiers to bring the division to full wartime strength. To accomplish this, the Army decided to cancel the Army Specialized Training Program, where high-testing privates were placed in universities to earn accelerated degrees and to qualify for commissioning. These bright young men were diverted to fill the ranks of understrength divisions to ensure that the Army had the manpower to ensure victory. Many men from ASTP and other units were transferred to the 95th Infantry Division to accomplish this task. While at Indiantown Gap, the majority of the division was sent to West Virginia to train in mountain climbing and rappelling. Others went to North Carolina for machine gun school. Afterwards, they returned to Indiantown Gap. After training for 2 years in deserts, swamps, and snow-laden mountains in freezing cold and in brutal heat, the 95th Division was well prepared for combat in Europe. On July 18, 1944, all passes were canceled and the entire division was confined to post. All communications in and out of Indiantown Gap were restricted. In the following days, the entire 95th Infantry Division was relocated by train to Camp Miles Standish near Boston. Subsequently, the division was transported to Liverpool, England on the USS West Point and the USS Mariposa. The ships zigzagged across the Atlantic, arriving in Liverpool August the 14th. The 95th Division was loaded onto trains and trucks and transported to Winchester, England. Winchester was flooded with supplies, equipment, and GIs readying themselves for the Channel crossing. It was here that the soldiers of the division experienced their first sights and sounds of the war, the ominous flights of the Nazi V-1 rockets. The division landed on Omaha Beach on September 14, 1944. That was D-Day plus 100 days. As the men waded onto the beach, their eyes saw stark evidence of the intense battle that had taken place 100 days earlier. As the division marched off the beach, the soldiers' moods turned somber, for they passed row after row of white wooden crosses. Immediately, men with military driver's licenses were sent to drive the Red Ball Highway. General Patton's Third Army was pushing east and in desperate need of supplies. The Red Ball Express was devised to continuously force supplies to frontline units as they were advancing rapidly through France, particularly General Patton's Third Army. Driving night and day, 95th soldiers supported this effort while the rest of the division continued preparations for combat earmarked to join General Patton in Lorraine. October 18, 1944, the 95th Infantry Division relieved the 5th Infantry Division at Pagny Bridgehead near Corny, France. This was the division's first front-line assignment. By the 1st of November, the division had relocated west of Metz, France. Plans were being drawn up for the assault on this massively defended ancient city, which had not been taken by an invading army since Attila the Hun in 451 AD. The city of Metz and surrounding defenses, a series of forts built, upgraded, and expanded over several centuries and wars, were manned by the 462nd Volksgrenadier Division and the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division. There were 3 combat operations that were essential before the division's successful capture of Metz could be realized. On November 8, 1st Battalion, 377th Regiment forced a crossing of the Moselle River at Ukanja in Operation Casanova. The purpose of this ruse was to draw the Germans away from Thionville and Fort Utes. Despite the overall success of the operation, 1st Battalion, 377th became stranded across the Moselle River and had to be resupplied by airdrops. Being stranded on the east side of the Moselle, they endured horrific shelling and mortar fire, resulting in the loss of over half of their soldiers. The second operation involved the 2nd and 3rd Battalions, 377th, attacking the slag pile, which held a commanding view of the enemy positions across the Moselle River and Chateaubriand in Mézières-le-Metz. Chateaubriand was a heavily fortified German position guarding an important crossing point of the Moselle River. Men from the 2nd and 3rd Battalions suffered horrible casualties in the assault on Chateaubriand. Further north, the 2nd Battalion, 378th, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Autry Moroun, was assigned to take the bridgehead in Thionville. This was a critical mission in that no bridge had been previously captured by the 90th or 5th Infantry Divisions to enable General Patton's army to cross the Moselle River. This mission started on November 11th, and by the 14th, 2nd Battalion, 378th had taken the bridgehead, Fort Utes, and Fort Delange. General Patton immediately ordered the 10th Armored Division across the newly constructed Bailey Bridge at Thionville. The 2nd Battalion, 378th Regiment, suffered more than 200 casualties in this action and was the only unit in the 95th Infantry Division to be awarded the Presidential Unit Citation for their actions. The result of all three of these operations allowed the 95th to successfully initiate the overall attack on Metz. On November 14, the 2nd and 3rd Battalions, 377th, continued their march east and south, capturing Wappi, Fort Gambetta, Sancenet, and Metz Nord. To their south, 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 378th Regiment attacked Fort Plappeville, Fort Saint-Quentin, and Longueville-les-Metz. Further south, the 379th Regiment fought savagely to take Fort Jeanne d'Arc, Fort Giza, and Fort Dréan. The 379th suffered numerous casualties while approaching these pillboxes and forts. Many of these massive fortresses were so impregnable that the 95th could only surround them and starve them into surrender. This attack on Metz and surrounding areas was a massive, coordinated effort. The 95th Infantry Division sustained horrific casualties as well as many missing in action and prisoners of war. During the final days of the Battle for Metz, the commanding officer of the German forces, General Heinrich Kittel, was captured. While he was being interrogated, the general, an expert in defensive fortifications, most recently assigned on the Eastern Front, said, "These men must have been made of iron to defeat his defenses." This title, bestowed on them by the German commander, is the name for which they will be known for eternity, the Iron Men of Metz. The city was officially declared liberated on November 22, 1944. Driving east of Metz, the 95th Division liberated towns, villages, and a Russian POW hospital. On November 28, the 95th Infantry Division crossed the border into Germany. Throughout the attack on Metz and the drive east toward the Saar River and the Siegfried Line, the heroic actions of Staff Sergeant Andrew Miller, G Company, 377th, are well documented. He was fluent in German and was an exceptional soldier. Time after time, he helped his squad out of serious firefights, either by single-handedly destroying machine gun positions or by talking the Germans into surrender. He was killed in action on November 29 near Himmersdorf, Germany, and was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the only Victory Division soldier to be so recognized. Soon after the 95th crossed the German border, the men were exposed to even more highly concentrated and accurate mortar and artillery fire than they had endured during the Battle for Metz. To the east is a mountainous ridge known as Saarburg. It was here the German artillery had a commanding view of the approach of the 95th Infantry Division. Protected by tank trap ditches, mines, and barbed wire entanglements, the German artillery placed their deadly accurate rounds. The stubborn German Wehrmacht, accompanying artillery and mortar units, were a part of the 21st Panzer Division. They were determined to stop the advancing 95th Infantry Division's approach to the Saar River Valley. Approaching the Saar River on the night of December 1st and 2nd, the soldiers watched as 400 U.S. medium bombers with their devastating payloads soften up fortifications in Saarlautern, Fraulautern, and Ensdorf. Lining the east bank of the Saar River were massive concrete bunkers or pillboxes, most buried under the earth with only the turret above ground. Others were cleverly disguised by building homes and barns over them. These pillboxes were armed with traversing guns, 20mm automatic guns, as well as machine guns. These were strategically placed so one pillbox could provide covering fire to its neighboring pillboxes. This interlocking fire made them deadly to approach and made up the heaviest fortified portion of the Siegfried Line. There had been an unusual amount of rain in that region, and the Germans had opened the floodgates of the Saar River upstream. This caused the river to flow out of its banks and flood the eastern shoreline by 600 to 800 yards. During the assault, 95th Engineers constructed footbridges across the swollen, rushing waters so the soldiers could force an attack at night. At night, men loaded down with gear and supplies often lost their footing with the bobbing of the footbridges and would never be seen alive again. Attacking the pillboxes was extremely dangerous. Any sound or detection of movement would alert the Germans, and flares would be sent up, illuminating the entire area. Machine gun fire and 20mm weapons would open up, raking the zone of attack. Using flares and in the early morning light, the German artillery and mortars would destroy the footbridges. These bridges would then have to be rebuilt the next night by the engineers. Once across the river, the fighting was intense from building to building and street to street. Many line companies lost a half or more of their men, and after weeks of harsh combat in horrific conditions, they were mentally and physically exhausted. Having to fight a determined dug-in enemy in wet, freezing mud made their mission miserable. The main bridge in Saarlautern was captured on December 3 by the 379th Regiment. It was wired for demolition and was captured just minutes before it was to be destroyed. On December 19, General Twaddle ordered all soldiers to pull back across the Saar, and any useful buildings or bunkers were to be destroyed. The 95th's neighboring infantry divisions, the 5th and 90th, were pulled out and sent to the Battle of the Bulge. The 95th remained and was thinly strung out to cover and defend the Siegfried Line area in their absence. The last week of January 1945, the men were ordered to remove all 95th Division patches and insignias from both their uniforms and vehicles. This was not a good sign. The 95th Division bugged out January 29th and headed for Maastricht, Holland. On February 3, the division was transferred to General Simpson's 9th Army. The 2nd British Army was also in need of support from German counterattacks on the northern flank of the Bulge. For several weeks, a few companies of the 95th Infantry Division were attached to the 2nd British Army to help defend against German counterattacks. The 95th Infantry Division, for the second time, marched across the German border and was now poised to attack across the Meuse and Ruhr rivers. The push was on to the Rhine River, driving the Germans deeper into their homeland. On the approach to the Rhine River, bitter fighting ensued at Krefeld, Uedingen, and the Adolf Hitler Bridge at Uedingen. At Rheinhausen, the soldiers came under the intense barrage of screaming Mimes, or Nebelwerfers. Crossing the Rhine River and into the Ruhr pocket, the 95th soldiers closed on the city of Hamm, a large rail transportation center. Hamm, with its wrecked rail yards, capitulated by April 4 after stubborn resistance was eliminated. April 7, soldiers of the 377th Regiment liberated 4,500 French officers and 600 enlisted men from a POW camp in Soest. The same day, the 379th Regiment liberated a large political prison camp in Wörl. 3 days later, soldiers of the 377th and the 194th Glider Infantry Regiments captured Baron Franz von Papen and his son, Captain Franz von Papen Jr. Baron Franz von Papen was a former Chancellor of Germany and ambassador to the United States. Von Papen was later tried and acquitted of war crimes at the Nuremberg Tribunal, but he did serve nearly 2 years in prison after being found guilty of war crimes by the West German government in 1947. Marching on, the 95th soldiers attacked Dortmund, Germany's 9th largest city. Dortmund was a great industrial city and an important rail center. The city's factories and rail yards had been severely damaged after several years of Allied bombings. They were in shambles. Once again, the soldiers were met with stiff resistance, but by April 13, Dortmund was cleared of resistance. The news of the death of President Franklin D. Roosevelt on April 12, 1945, spread throughout the 95th Infantry Division like fire. It was shocking news that brought a somber tone over the entire division. The 95th Infantry Division pushed on towards the Ruhr River, and by this time had completed its mission in the Ruhr pocket. At the end of April, the division soldiers uncovered a mass grave at Warstein. The local inhabitants were forced to dig up the dead and dig individual graves. The entire local population, some 8,000 plus, was compelled to file past the bodies of the dead before funeral services were performed. The 95th Infantry Division is one of 36 divisions recognized by the Holocaust Memorial Museum as a liberating division. The 95th Infantry Division turned north and billeted near Bremen. Here, several units were temporarily transferred to the U.S. Navy to provide security for the docks and submarine assembly areas. After May 8, 1945, VE Day, the soldiers of the 95th Infantry Division served as an occupation force enforcing military law and government. Following this duty, the division reported to Camp Old Gold to turn in equipment, rest, and prepare to embark for the United States. The 95th Division returned to Boston at the end of June and was given a 30-day furlough. The division reassembled at Camp Shelby near Hattiesburg, Mississippi, where it trained for overseas deployment to the Pacific. The dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6 and 9 forced the unconditional surrender of the Japanese Empire. With the end of World War II, the 95th Infantry Division's mission had come to an end. The division had been commanded from its activation on July 10, 1942, to its inactivation on October 15, 1945, by Major General Harry L. Twaddle. General Twaddle held the longest tenure as a commanding general of a U.S. Army division during World War II. He commanded with intellectual prowess and outstanding leadership. He was highly respected by subordinate officers as well as enlisted men. The success of the 95th Infantry Division's operations in the ETO was directly attributable to the outstanding leadership from the commanding officer through each level of command. Soldiers of the 95th Infantry Division killed in action and whose bodies were not brought back to the United States are buried or have their names engraved on the walls of the missing in American military cemeteries throughout Europe. They are interred in the Luxembourg American Cemetery, Netherlands American Cemetery, and the Lorraine American Cemetery. Nestled in the rolling countryside of eastern Lorraine is the Lorraine American Cemetery at Saint-Avold, France, the largest World War II military cemetery in Europe with 10,489 American graves. The division suffered a total of 6,591 casualties, including 1,205 killed in action, 380 prisoners of war, and 61 missing in action during World War II. All of the soldiers of the 95th made tremendous sacrifices, and some the ultimate sacrifice, leaving the division with a distinguished heritage. After its inactivation at Camp Shelby on October 15, 1945, the 95th Division didn't remain dormant for long. The emerging Cold War brought about its reactivation on May 13, 1947, at Oklahoma City as a part of the United States Army Reserve. On April 1, 1958, the 95th Infantry Division was redesignated as the 95th Division Training, one of several training divisions that would train new soldiers in anticipation of full mobilization if war were to come, most probably with the Soviet Union. In 1967, the nom de guerre that had been bestowed on the 95th Division by the German General Heinrich Kittel, the Iron Men of Metz, was officially recognized as the division's nickname. The Institute of Heraldry approved the nickname and a new crest to be worn by all units of the 95th Division, commemorating the Victory Division's exploits and sacrifice in World War II. By the early 1990s, in addition to conducting basic combat training and advanced individual training for active Army, National Guard, and Army Reserve soldiers, the division was assigned to provide military occupational specialty training for all combat support and combat service support MOSs. This expansive schoolhouse responsibility resulted in the division's redesignation as the 95th Division Institutional Training. While still headquartered in Oklahoma City, the division now had units in 9 Midwestern states. Following the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, soldiers of the 95th Division deployed to Iraq, Afghanistan, and other locations in Central Command, as well as mobilized stateside to train soldiers for overseas duty. For the first time since World War II, soldiers wearing the 95th patch deployed to combat zones, most notably to Afghanistan, where units trained new soldiers, established an Afghan drill sergeant school, and advised and supported Afghan units in the field. During the War on Terror, the 95th Division lost two former exceptional soldiers. First Sergeant Tobias C. Meister and Major Scott Haggerty, both killed by IEDs while assigned to civil affairs units. In 2008, the Army Reserve underwent a substantial transformation to better meet the needs of the future. The 95th Division was redesignated as the 95th Division Initial Entry Training, as its mission was streamlined to focus only on training new soldiers. Headquartered at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, it has units from coast to coast. Drill sergeants are the backbone of the Army, and the 95th Division has produced some of its finest in the tradition of their forebearers, the Iron Men of Metz. Whatever the future holds, the 95th Division stands ready to meet the challenges of a changing world.